Okay, so the plan this evening is for us to talk about the ethics at the beginning and the end of life. And I wish that we had a bit more time on this topic than just simply one lesson, because I think these are very, very important topics that often we face in our churches, but we don't often talk about very much, right? I think as a pastor, of course, whenever the issue comes up, I will often get asked one-to-one about it. But in terms of kind of teaching that happens in a local church, seems to be fairly sparse, and yet these are really, really, really important issues, and these issues, they become even more important as different societies stray from a biblical worldview. I think partly what we'll find is that when we look at things through a biblical worldview, many of these issues are fairly straightforward in terms of how we should approach it. Now, some of them are tricky, and I think they do require a lot of nuance to think about them. But some of the basic or more contentious issues, the Bible's quite clear on those things. But the issue is, as any society moves away from Jesus and moves away from the Bible, inevitably their ethical system also does, and it really does show through in these particular issues in so many ways. So when we think about beginning and end of life, so beginning of life, we're thinking about, as I said, contraception, abortion, assistive reproductive technologies, as like IVF, embryo research, stem cell research, these kinds of things. And end of life issues, we're talking about things like euthanasia, suicide, and other issues as well. There's a lot of related issues to these, I guess, and these issues, like even issues like burial or cremation. Is it okay for someone to be cremated? Or what about organ donation, human experimentation? We'll try and say something about each of these topics that is kind of related to this area as well. So we've only got, don't have too long this evening, so we can't cover all of them in detail, but hopefully at least can get us thinking, and also point you to a few resources that will help you along the way. And along those lines, I want to just recommend a couple of resources up front. So you've got the textbook, of course, which is very helpful, especially on I think mainly focuses on abortion and euthanasia, but treats those issues quite well. Doesn't say too much about the other many of the other issues. But that's a good starting place. Then you've got the various ethics books that we've thought about, like Joined Up Life. Again, that's got quite a number of chapters on these topics, which would be very helpful to look at. If you want to look at books that's kind of dedicated to the topic, it's hard to go past this particular one. This is it's called. Let me take the blurring off my camera. This is called Fearfully and Wonderfully Made by Megan Best, Dr. Megan Best. And you can see, I don't know if you can see, but it's a very thick book. It's like about 500 pages, and it's focused on ethics at the beginning of life. Only the beginning of life issues. 500 pages, very, very detailed. She herself is a medical doctor, and also is has theological education and so on. So it's really a very brilliant book. And any of these issues that you really want to dive in a lot more detail, this is would be a great one to look at. If you want something that is short and sweet, and sometimes people like short and sweet books, it's hard to go past this one. This is Bioethics, a Primer for Christians, Gilbert Meilander. And this is the third edition. I'm not sure how many editions they're up to now, but it keeps being republished because it's such an excellent book. This book doesn't refer to a lot of Bible verses or things like that, right? But it does treat the issues from a Christian perspective. and it talks about things like abortion, genetic advances, prenatal screening. Someone asked about that just now. Suicide, euthanasia, refusal of treatment, organ donation, human experimentation, and various other things as well. Nice short chapters, but really insightful and clear. And I think sometimes it's helpful to just look at a simple, clear treatment. And then if you need more, then of course you can go to the, to the thicker reference book. So I will pick up some of the things from those books in this class tonight, but highly recommend those if you want to dig a little bit deeper. Now, the key issue that is at the heart of this is basically what makes a person valuable, right? And it's that key question that really will determine your position on many of these issues. And of course, in many societies, a person's value is defined by their happiness, by their achievements, maybe what they can contribute to society, and things like that. And so sometimes someone's value is not kind of inherent in who they are, but basically what they can contribute. So we think, look, if someone so maybe people think, okay, if you do your screening test of the baby and you think, oh, this baby is going to have Down syndrome or whatever, we think they're going to have a difficult life, or they can't contribute to society or something like that, then they think, well, that affects the value of the child because their health has been impaired by the sickness. At the other end of life, it's the same thing. So you've got the person who is aging, and as the person ages, and your body slowly stops working, and you start to lose your memory, or you can't walk anymore, or you can't do this or that. And again, people think, well, I'm not valuable. I can't contribute anymore like I used to. I'm a burden on my family, or these kinds of things. And so the person's value is tied up in what they can contribute, or what they can do, or how happy they are, or something like that, rather than, so it's some external attribute or marker, rather than being tied up in who they are. But of course, as Christians, we understand that a person's value is not determined by their achievements. It's not determined by their happiness or these kinds of things, but someone's value is determined by God, right? Both in creation and redemption, right? So in creation, we are valuable, inherently valuable, because we are made in the image of God. And regardless of how healthy or otherwise we are made in the image of God, whether we are old, young, male, female, black or white, or whatever it is. We are made in God's image, and so we are inherently valuable, and not just valuable in creation, of course, but valuable in redemption as well, because God sent his son into the world to save us. And that just shows how valuable we are to God. He didn't have to send his son to save us. So the fact that he did send his son to die on the cross shows our value. So our value is found in our God-given identity. It's not found in in our works, or what we can contribute. But of course, if you are thinking in a works-based way, then you tend to value some life more than others, right? Based on what it can contribute. And you see this all the time, I guess, when you watch the media, because I think many times, I don't know, the Western media tends to dominate a lot of the news headlines and things, and so we tend to see, from BBC or from the various American networks and so on, Reuters and so on. So we tend to get our news from Western sources, and so yeah, if there's like an awful tragic mass shooting or something in the States, or there is something like that, it tends to get a lot more airtime or focus than other issues, say like the starvation in Africa, or the bombings that are always happening in Nigeria, or whatever it is, right? And that's just always the case, isn't it? Whenever you watch a country's news, they tend to focus on the news that's closest to them and that affects them more. And it's the same thing with Malaysian news, of course, as well. And partly that's, of course, just because we are relational beings, and so we feel something has a greater impact on us the closer that we are to the person, right? In other words, the more that they are like us, or we can identify with them, then the more strongly the issue impacts upon us. But this can be problematic, isn't it? Because it means that there's a tendency for us to value some lives or some issues more than other issues. So for example, you will have if there's as I said, like some tragedy or something, a train crash or a car crash or something like that, and someone gets killed. Often this will end up on the news. But the thing that won't end up on the news is the millions of babies that are aborted every year, or things like this. And you think, okay, this one impacts us more, and this one is kind of hidden away. But are they really? Is there different levels of a person's value depending on who they are, and so on, right? The other strand which we will see in Scripture is that God cares about the vulnerable, right? And there's actually many verses on this issue of social justice and so on in the Bible. Many verses about God caring for the widow, for the orphan, for the alien and stranger, the foreigner, etc. God seems to have a special care for those who are least able to protect themselves, and really, that's especially what we are talking about this evening. We are dealing with issues where people are quite vulnerable, right? We're talking about babies. We're talking about the elderly, and so on. Often people who are vulnerable, right? So yeah, let's dive in and have a look at a couple of biblical principles here. So firstly, the first biblical principle, of course, is the value of human life. And as we were saying, that our value as human beings is derived from us being from both creation and redemption, being made in the image of God. So for example, if we open up to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26, and before this, God has created the various parts of creation, including the animals, the birds, the flowers, etc. But then verse 26, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So humanity is given a special dignity and value here, being made in the image of God, because nothing else in the creation is made in the image of God. Only human beings. And we also see this reflected in the valuing of Christian life. So if we were to come across to Genesis chapter 9, this is now after the flood. Of course, before the flood, they just ate fruit from the trees and so on. After the flood, we read this: God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. the fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hands they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. But you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is its blood. And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I'll require it, and from man, for his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of a man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So you see the change there. So God says, look, you can eat the animals, right? But if you take the life of a man, then God will require a reckoning, right? There will be a punishment. And of course, throughout the Old Testament law, the punishment for murder is usually death. And notice how this is then related to being made in God's image. So animals are not made in God's image, and so they don't have the same value as human beings do. Now, don't hear me wrong. That's not saying that animals don't have any value. You know, God cares about animals. He cares about plants. He wants us to care for the creation He's made, and so on, right? But you can eat pork or chicken or whatever for your dinner, but you can't go and harm another human being, because human beings have inherent value because they are made in the image of God. And therefore, as I said, often the punishment for taking someone's life throughout the Bible is the death penalty. The other principle we want to keep in mind here, though, is that we are creatures. We are not the creator, right? We are made in the image of God, yes, but we are created beings. God is the creator, and so in that sense, God reserves for Himself the right to take life, and to give life, and to take life. This is not something that is in the hands of human beings to do, right? And we need to keep this in mind. So someone was asking, you know, how much control do we have over life? Well, God's the one who gives life. God is the one who takes life, and it's not our prerogative ever to end someone's life, whether our life or other people's life. We are by nature contingent beings. And therefore we don't have that right to take life from other people. So let's kind of pick up a couple of issues related to this, and then we'll see if we've got any questions along the way. So let's start with the assisted production stuff, right? And here is basically where you are using various medical technologies in order to help people conceive, right? So there are different types of treatments here. So the first one is artificial insemination. This is where you take the semen from the man and artificially put it into the mother, right? Then you have IVF, in vitro fertilization. So this is where you instead of just taking the sperm from the man, you also take the egg from the woman, and then you fertilize it out of the outside of the body. And this process started in 1978. It accounts for about 5% of births, and usually the way that IVF works is it doesn't have like a 100% success rate. So usually they will take a number of eggs from the mother, usually quite a number. It could be like 5 or 7 or 10 or more. And they'll keep trying until they get success, because of course IVF is a very expensive treatment. They want to try and give results to those who are paying for it, and so you take lots and lots of eggs, but only about 20 to 30% of eggs result in the birth of a child, right? So you take many eggs and create many embryos, but you don't necessarily have the intention of bringing all of those embryos into to life. So this is where the IVF treatment can become quite problematic in many ways. Basically, the issue is this, and we were asking just now about, well, when does life begin? The Bible seems quite clear that life begins at the point where the egg is fertilized, as in it begins in the womb, right? Often the way that our legal systems work today is often the child will only have various legal rights once it is born, yeah. But while it's in the womb, it tends to have less legal rights. But I think from a biblical perspective, the life begins in the womb itself. There are various verses that point to this. I think Psalm 139 is one of the great psalms in the Bible. And we read in verse 13, "You formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." That's where the name of this book comes from, of course. Fearfully and wonderfully made, from this verse. "Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them," right? And so you can see here that God is the one who's forming the child, even in the womb, even as we are being made. We're known and seen in the mind and heart of God. And you see this reflected in other places as well. Just in passing, if you think about Luke chapter 1, when Mary visits Elizabeth, and where and as this happened, we're told the baby leapt in her womb, right? And Elizabeth was filled with the Spirit. She exclaimed with a loud cry, "Blessed are you among women, blessed is the fruit of your womb. Why is it granted to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me? When the sound of your greeting came to my ears, the baby in my womb leapt for joy," right? And notice how it's called a baby in the womb, and it's reacting to what's happening outside of the womb. It leaps for joy, and so on and so forth. So the Bible very much presents the child in the womb as alive and living. Yeah. You can look at various other verses, and you'll see many of those listed in the textbook. I think what is also very compelling on this is to just look at photos of the development of a child in the womb, right? And I'm opening up here from Baby Center, which is, if you've had a baby, I'm sure you know about Baby Center, because every mother looks at Baby Center when they're having their child and following all the progress. Fetal development week by week. So fertilization 2 weeks, that's the sperm going into the egg. One of them implants in the egg, and that's that at that point you have all the chromosomes needed for this embryo to become a child. and then it starts to multiply, to make more and more cells. And I think it's really just striking just how quickly it starts to look like a human being. This is 6 weeks, and it's not full. It doesn't look like fully like a human, with the tail and whatever. You haven't got formed legs and whatever, but you can already see it taking shape, right? You can see the beginning of the mouth, ears, eyes, intestines, brain, and then this continues on, and it continues on very, very, very quickly, right? This is about what, 9 weeks. It's already got tiny hands, feet, and so on. So this happens very, very, very early on. Now, at this point, of course, it's the baby is still extremely small, right? But they're already reacting. So it's just, look, their fingers will begin to open and close, the toes will curl, their mouth will make sucking movements, preparing for feeding after they come out, and so on and so forth. So we can continue on, and of course this, after 36 weeks or whatever it is, the baby will be fully formed, right? And then will be born. And I just find that's very very, very striking, isn't it? Because it's just so early on. It recognizably looks like a human child, right? And this is often the stage at which abortions and so on are taking place. So yeah, so biblically speaking, yeah, where once you have the sperm and the egg come together, at that point, in the right conditions, right, that it will develop into a human life, right? It will grow, it will be born, it will grow up like the rest of us, and age, and so on. It's just one continuous process. Once that first sperm meets the egg, and so that's why we, as Christians, we will rightly focus on, well, that's a human being at that point, right? And therefore that that embryo, that human being, it has the right to life, and it's made in God's image. It has inherent value. It's vulnerable. It should be protected, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah. Now, once you start dealing with the various issues related to IVF and things like this, and screening and so on, the waters start to get murky very quickly, don't they? So what about designer babies? Like sometimes if you want a male child or a female child, a boy or a girl, and you can once they do the fertilize the egg in the dish, they can do various tests to tell you certain things about that child. What's the gender going to be, or what's the what's the likelihood it's going to have this issue or that issue, and so on. And then very quickly you can start to play God, isn't it? And think, well, I want this particular type of baby, and I don't want this particular type. I want a boy, I don't want a girl, I want this or that. Then there's issues of surrogacy as well, because what happens if you have the sperm from one person, the egg from another person, and then, well, who's going to carry the child, right? Theoretically, at this point, the fertilized egg could be put in anyone, right? And any mother could carry the child, and so on. And it's actually possible for a child to have 5 different parents. I know that's very confusing, right? But it's possible for a child to have 5 different parents. So there's the genetic parents; those are the from the sperm and the egg. Then you can have the surrogate, right? The one who carries the child for the 9 months and gives birth to the child, right? That's the third one. And then you might have another set of parents that actually rear the child, who paid for the whole thing, right? Who paid for this whole process, and then take the child once it's been born. And so then who's the parents of the child? Because you've had five, the child has 5 different parents, and that's obviously very, very messy, and that's not how it's meant to be, right? Obviously, as in God's design, the genetic parents is meant to be the actual parents of the child, right? Now there are other. So once you understand that the fertilized egg is basically a human being, then this has a lot of implications for IVF, because it means, for example, if you are a Christian engaging in IVF, then you should be committed to bringing every one of those fertilized eggs to give it a chance of life, you see. So if you're going to fertilize 5 eggs, then you need to be committed to bringing all 5 of those into the world as children. So generally, for a Christian, therefore, who's engaging in IVF, you would want to fertilize less eggs. You see, don't fertilize 10 eggs or something like that, which you're not going to be able to look after them all, right? Maybe you only do 3, or you only do 4, or something like this. But of course, this is going to go totally against what the agency who's doing it wants, right? Because they want you to have 100% success rate, because that affects their their KPIs and their business and so on. So they're going to want you to fertilize many eggs. And if you only fertilize 3 or 4, well, if it's only got a 20 to 30% success rate on an egg, then there's every chance that the process doesn't work, right? And you don't have a living baby that comes out of the process. So I think with IVF, it's not inherently wrong for a Christian to engage in it, right? But the Christian needs to understand actually what is actually going on with IVF, and understand what's going on, and therefore make wise Christian decisions about how they engage with it. There are other issues as well. One of the other things about IVF, of course, is that it's extremely expensive, right? And if you're starting to spend 20, 40, 60 or more, 100,000 ringgit trying to conceive a child, then when is enough enough? I think that's one of the big questions to ask. Why, if I'm struggling to have a child, when should I stop trying? Sometimes the desire to have a child is a good thing, of course, isn't it? We are made in the image of God. God's part of that is that we are relational beings. God says, be fruitful and multiply. And so it's natural as human beings that we would want to bring our own child into the world. And we live in a fallen world where that's not always possible, where barrenness and things like this exist, and that's very painful, and it's extremely difficult. It's one of those hard things that many people go silently suffer through, and people always ask them the question, when are you going to have a child, or when are you going to have a baby? And they don't know that all this while in the background you've been struggling. But when is enough enough? When has wanting to have a child become an idol? And now it's more about me and my own happiness, rather than being about the child, right? Because of course, God's design for children is that they are the fruit of love. You see, they are the fruit of our love for one another. So, sex between a man and a woman results in a child that then becomes the object of a mutual love, which then bonds the parents closer together as they love the child and love each other. But if you love the child, or you want the child too much, why is that the case? And has this thing become more important to me than God Himself? When should I say, well, actually, adoption maybe is a better option for me, right? I think adoption is a wonderful Christian thing, and of course we know that from the fact that God adopts us into His family. It's one of the spiritual blessings in Ephesians chapter 1, is that God sets His love on us, and He brings us into His own family when we are not worthy to do so. And so, on the one hand, there are lots of people in the world who are aborting babies and or just not able to look after their babies. There's babies that have been orphaned from their parents and so on, and that's where, with adoption and fostering, Christians can actually do a lot of good. And at what point would it be better, to actually adopt a child and set your love on that child rather than spending, massive amount of money trying to have my own child? So this is some of the issues that we have to navigate, but they are very, very very difficult, and they are very, very sensitive. I wonder if you want to ask any questions so far.
Hello, Tim. It says in your notes that adoption is to be avoided.
Where does it say that?
Under principles, part 2 principles, adoption is thus an emergency procedure to be avoided wherever possible.
What we're saying there is that basically a child, wherever possible, should be brought up by their own parents, right? There are cases where, for whatever reason, that's not possible, because the child's parents have died, or because they have particular mental illness or physical illness or whatever that makes them incapable of being able to look after their own child. There are cases like this, but generally speaking, we want to do everything that we can to help parents look after their own child rather than putting up a child to adoption, right? I think that's what the notes is saying there. Yeah, the adoption issue is can be a very tricky one, especially in some parts of the world. I know in Malaysia, you definitely have to be very, very careful. If you are going to adopt, you need to get quite a lot of advice and make sure that you're going through the right means and so on, because sometimes what can happen is that there is child trafficking, right? And sometimes there are children that have been forcefully taken from their parents against their will, and then being sold on the adoption market and so on. And as a Christian, that's not what we don't want to be supporting this kind of illegal and horrible practices, right? So we do need to be quite careful to make sure that this is a valid adoption, in the sense that the parents really do want to allow you to adopt a child. Yeah. I think in a lot of Western countries, they have very, very strict processes as well. But I think in Malaysia, it can be a little bit tricky. Yeah. Okay, let's go on to the abortion stuff. And of course, this is a huge issue. And when we are talking about abortion, we are talking about the expulsion of the human fetus prematurely before it is capable of surviving outside the womb. Now, of course, an accident could cause an abortion or induce one, but here we're especially talking about when it is deliberately done. How common is this? In 2000, I haven't got the latest statistics, but in 2003, in Australia, there was 254,000 births. And in the same year, Australian women had 90,000 abortions, right? That's a very, very significant percentage. It's like what, 25% or 20% of children being aborted, and that doesn't include abortions caused by the morning after pill or these kinds of other drugs like RU486. And the abortion issue has become very politicized in many years over the years. Basically there's the two sides of it. There's the pro-choice and the pro-life, and the pro-choice champions the rights of the woman and says, look, it's my body, I should have the right to do what I want with my body, and if I don't want to be pregnant, then I should be able to abort the baby. And then there's the pro-life, which is essentially championing the rights of the fetus and saying, well, it's yes, as a mother you have certain rights and so on, but the baby's also a human, and so doesn't the fetus also have rights as well. And you might know the key case was the Roe versus Wade case from 1973. And the original ruling on that was that a woman cannot be legally prohibited from obtaining an abortion until the fetus is viable and can live outside the mother's womb. And essentially what that case did was opened the door for abortions to happen before a particular time. So I can't remember the exact number. Is it about, I don't know, 24 weeks or something before before the fetus is viable outside of the womb? It's certainly quite late on in the pregnancy that only then it becomes viable. So essentially that case said, until it can viably live outside the womb, then it's okay to abort the child. Now, you may know in the United States that case has been revisited recently and overturned, and this has led to a whole bunch of new, abortion being banned in various states of America, and then lots of lawsuits and protests and so on to try and reinstate abortion in some of these states. So it's very much a live issue and so on. And as we've seen, it from a Christian point of view, it really comes down to when does life begin, all right? And if we understand that life begins with the fertilized egg, with the fetus, then it's not just murder when it becomes viable, when it reaches the age of viability, or when it's born, right? But it's from the very beginning. So one of the 10 Commandments is you shall not murder, right? And if if that is a human being, and which I would argue that it is, then Christians would rightly argue that abortion at that point is especially murder, and therefore is sinful and is and wrong, right? And therefore we should protest against it, and we should be very, very troubled by so many abortions that do take place. And this is not a new perspective for Christians. Let's just look up a couple of the couple of the verses here. So Exodus 20, verse 13 is the 10 Commandments. You shall not murder. Exodus chapter 21, verse 22. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her child comes out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judge determines. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And you can see there how the child that's come out and the harm that's caused to it is being treated as though it's a full human being. Psalm 139 we've already looked at. And then John 9, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. It's a very interesting passage, isn't it? And it's saying, look, here's a man that's born with a disability, right? But Jesus says, this disability is not some punishment for the man or for his parents, but is actually can be used for the glory of God, right? And I think that's the case. And I think those who, of course, it's going to be very challenging to care for someone who, for a baby that has various health conditions. Of course, that can be very, very challenging. But often these children, they can be sources of great joy, and bring glory to God in so many ways, especially as their parents set their love on them. I've been privileged to know various people who've gone through this kind of thing. I think there was one dear friend of mine who conceived and whatever, and as they were going through the various checkups, it was discovered that the child had very severe complications, I guess you would call it, and essentially they were told that the child wouldn't live, right, and therefore should be aborted, right? And they were Christians. They were they were in ministry and so on. So they didn't do that. They carried the child to the full term, right? And the child was born, and basically the child survived, right? And the child had many operations, many operations, but survived, and for all intents and purposes now is a healthy is a healthy and happy child, right? And yet they were told that this child would not live. It was not a viable child. And I think that's why we've got to be very, very careful about deciding who lives and who dies and so on. I think that ultimately that's something that we want to leave to God. Now that's one story. I know other stories as well, right? Of people who have conceived a child and they've been told that this child is not going to live, and so on. And they carried the child, and one dear friend of mine, the child was born. I think this child survived for the first 45 minutes or something like that, maybe an hour or 2 hours after birth. And then passed away, and they had a full funeral for the child, and grief for the child, and all of that, and they made they gave the testimonies and so on at the funeral. Why did they do this, and so on and so forth, and you know, for them, those precious moments that they had, a very, very short time, but precious moments they had with a child, holding it in their arms, and then, you know, burying burying the child. She said, yeah, this is a human life that has value and so on. And it was a tremendous testimony to the gospel, I think, and of their love as Christian parents. So yeah. So if you're saying, look, only a child should only be born if it's 100% healthy, right? Then what you're saying is that someone's value is not determined simply by being human, right? But determined by the quality of life they can have, or the, you know, how much they can contribute to society, or some other factor like that. Now, we'll see later in the lecture, if you start thinking in this kind of way, then this has issues for end of life as well, right? Because what happens if, you know, someone's in a coma, or if they're, you know, they've got Alzheimer's or whatever it is, right? At that point, because they cannot contribute to society or whatever, does that mean they're no longer valuable and they should therefore be, you know, euthanized or whatever? You end up with similar issues at the end of life if you start thinking in this along this kind of way, right? So yeah, if you deny personhood to a fetus, then you inevitably deny it to the disabled, to the senile, to those in comas, and so on and so forth, right? Now, of course, there are tricky areas, and I think with ethics, it's rarely black and white. I mean, there are some issues that are just clearly right and wrong, right? You know, should you abort a child? Well, basically, the Christian answer is no, you shouldn't, right? Under pretty much all circumstances. But what happens if the pregnancy is going to lead to the death of the mother, right? Then it becomes more tricky, you see. What should happen there? Should the mother, you know, because, you know, what should happen there? Should the mother just keep carrying on the child, and then the mother dies, and then the baby dies as well, right? Or should you save the mother's life by taking the life of the child? There are these kind of very, very tricky areas, right? And of course, you know, that's where you need the thick books to try and really think very hard on these particular issues. But those are not most cases, right? They're probably the 1% or the 0.1% cases, rather than the bulk of abortions and so on. I'm going to just stop there, though. You want to ask any questions around abortion and you know, adoption, IVF, all these issues?
Tim, what about pregnancy resulting from a rape?
Yeah.
What is there a biblical view on that?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, there is a biblical view on that. Yeah. Again, it's a very, very tragic situation. It's something that shouldn't happen, isn't it? And but we live in a fallen, sinful world where sometimes horrible things happen. You know, sometimes you know, I don't think that means necessarily that the I don't think that means that the mother should get married to the abuser. You know, there's sometimes where it's suggested that because they've you know, been raped, and therefore they hadn't got pregnant, therefore now they should then marry the abuser, so that they you know, to something like that. I don't think that would be horribly abusive for the to the mother. But yeah, I think what we would want to do is to rally around that mother who's gone through that awful situation, and you would try to do everything that you possibly can to help her to give birth to the child and to to raise the child, right? Many times the problem comes if we think too individualistically about things. Yeah. Whereas, of course, the Bible, as we've seen, thinks about us as a network of mutually loving relationships. God puts us in families, and these families then, you know, together make up society and so on. So we are, you know, as a society, you know, we and certainly in our families, we would want to do everything that we possibly can to help that mother to keep the child and so on. Now, is there going to be suffering involved if, you know, if they're like 14 or 16 and then they have to drop out of school and they've got no you know, they can't work, and of course it's a dreadfully difficult situation, but at the same time that doesn't mean that the vulnerable baby should be aborted, right? Whatever circumstances the child has been born into, it still has inherent value because it's, you know, he or she is made in the image of God. Yeah, I'll just stop there. Do you want to ask more?
Tim, I'm just curious for those, because we agreed that life starts from fetus. And then how about salvation for those unborn baby, miscarriage baby, you know, those baby that are weak, you know, like what you said, your friends that 1 year old, or those who are born with problems who cannot respond to the gospel?
Yeah. That's a really good question, and the short answer is that if they are born to one or more Christian parents, as in either the father or mother or both is Christians, then most Christians will believe that the child would certainly be saved and be in heaven. If it's born to both parents are non-Christians, the Bible is slightly more silent on that issue, I think. And I'll come to that second issue in a moment. But in terms of the first one, where it's born to one or more parents who are Christian, I think 1 Corinthians 7 is one passage you could look at. So here he's talking about divorce. He says, to the rest, I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. The unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? How do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? So the key part here is where he says that, so here you have a wife or a husband who is, one of them is Christian and the other one is an unbeliever. And what Paul says is that the children are holy. The children are not unclean. Now, does that mean that they are saved? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that, right? But there seems to be something that what Paul is saying is that, yeah, you might be married to an unbeliever, but it doesn't mean that your child, the child that is born simply because your child has come from one unbeliever. It doesn't mean that the child is somehow defiled or displeasing to God or something like that. And he's saying, no, if you are a Christian, then the child is holy. It's holy to the Lord. And so many Christians would argue, and I would agree with this, is that based on this kind of verse, that the child that is born to one or more Christian parents, that I basically think that they would be saved. So the cases that I've mentioned just now, that's how it was celebrated, that the child is with the Lord. One day they will get to be reunited with them in glory and so on. And I think that's right. Now, what about the case where the parents are non-believers? At that point, there's no verse like 1 Corinthians 7 that answers that question. So I think what we have to do at that point is simply fall back on the character of God. And we know what God is like. We know that he is good. He is gracious. We know that he is just, right? He's righteous. He always does what is right. He always does what is good. He's always loving all the time. And therefore, whatever he does in that case, in the end, when we get to glory, we will praise him for it. So I take it that means that the child will be saved, but ultimately, I think we have to just leave it in, trust in the goodness of God and leave it in his hands. So that's how I'd approach that particular question. Okay, let's just pick up a couple of last issues on the beginning of life stuff, and then we'll take a break and we'll come back on the end of life stuff. So in terms of the other issues related to the beginning of life, we've got contraception, we've got prenatal screening, and we've got genetic research. So someone asked just now, what should Christians think about family planning and so on and so forth. So the first thing to say is that, of course, the Bible views children as a blessing, right? And they are the natural. They're one of the purposes of marriage, right? So remember, after God creates humanity in his image, male and female, he says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the heavens and so on. And that's God's purpose, right? Why is it not good that the man is alone? Well, if the man's alone, he can't have dominion over the world by himself, and he can't be fruitful and multiply by himself. So God makes the helper fit with him so that together they can fulfill the their commission, right? As God's image bearers. So I take it therefore that that children should that married couples should desire to have children and see them as a blessing, right? And therefore to deliberately not have children when you can have children seems to be presented as against God's purposes and therefore sinful to me. Now, to say that, you've got to be careful about that though, right? Because the thing is, many times it's not that someone doesn't want to have children, right? But they are unable to have children for whatever reason. And so if you see a married couple in church and they've been married for 5 years and they haven't had a child yet, and you keep saying, when are you going to have your first child or whatever it is, shouldn't you be fruitful and multiply or whatever? And it's nearly always it's an extremely insensitive thing to say, and more than likely they've been trying to have children for a long time, and this is a source of great anguish and grief to them that they haven't been able to do so. So I think before you come down and judge people, and why haven't you had children yet, then you need to make sure that you know the facts. And most of the time we don't know the facts, and it's none of our business. And we need to be very, very careful about judging people in that way. But in general, I think, the view is that Christians should view children as a blessing from the Lord and desire to have children and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that you should have necessarily have unlimited children. I don't think that the Bible is against contraceptions. Now, of course, in one sense, modern contraceptions are very new, right? And it's easy to forget that. I mean, with condoms and various other contraceptive methods like the pills and various things, they didn't exist until 100 years ago. Those things didn't exist really. So, but even though that's the case, it doesn't mean that it was impossible to practice some form of contraception before that, right? I mean, it's possible, of course, to have to have sex in such a way that you don't you don't impregnate the mother or whatever. So even without modern contraceptive methods. So I think it's probably wrong to think that there was no practice of contraception before the modern day stuff. So yeah, I think as a Christian, in general, I don't think contraception is inherently wrong in the way that the Catholic Church presents it. Of course, in Catholicism is just blanket against all contraception, and therefore Roman Catholics tend to have very large families. I'm not sure that that's the case. I think the Bible is inherently against contraception. Having said that, I think there are some forms of contraception that Christians should have problems with, right? So, for example, we talked about the morning after pill, these kinds of things. This could be very problematic, isn't it? Because essentially, what you're doing is trying to kill the fertilized egg, right? Essentially, that's just another form of extremely early abortion, which we should basically consider as murder as well. So basically, any type of contraception that kills a fertilized egg, Christians should have issues with that kind of contraception. But other ones whether it's the condoms or the various barriers or whatever, that basically they prevent the egg from being fertilized. I think that's how many of the contraceptive pills basically work. They work in such a way that the egg cannot be fertilized by the sperm, and therefore there is no fertilization of the egg, and therefore there's no death of the fetus or these kind of things. So in general, there's no issue for Christians with say the contraceptive pill or the or condoms or these forms of contraception. But there are many forms of contraception, and not all of them work in that particular way. So I think, again, as you think about, well, what contraception are you going to use, then you need to understand how does it work, and therefore, is this something that is ethical, or is it not ethical? So I think, yeah, there can be wisdom in terms of family planning, and thinking about when you have children and so on. Maybe even how many children you can you can care for well, and so on. Generally speaking, we should, in an Asian setting, we should probably have more children than we do. I mean, I think these days, if you think of a country like Singapore or whatever, usually you only have, they tend to have very small families, maybe just like one child or two child, because basically this is very expensive to have a child, and they have a particular standard of life they want it to give, and so maybe you're choosing between particular education, or owning a car or not owning a car, or these types of things, and sometimes people is choosing to have just one child or someone in order to have a particular freedoms in life or quality of life or things like this. This seems to me to be quite problematic, right? Because in many ways you're making decisions based on wealth, or having a particular standard of living, or my own material happiness and things like this, which doesn't seem to me to be a Christian pursuit of things, where we would, the Christian should be a sacrificial servant, who's generous and loving and lays down their life for the sake of others. And so I think in general, because in an Asian culture, we tend to idolize money so much, and want a particular, have very high views of education and career and things like this. You see the birth rate is massively dropping, right? But as I think if you have a Christian worldview, it should very much turn that on its head, as you realize that actually relationships is more important than stuff, and the Christian way is one of service and sacrifice, not just about accumulation of material things for myself and so on. So I think in general, if you have a Christian worldview, you will tend to marry earlier, and you will tend to have more children, because you are placing more value on relationships than you are on the other things. The Asian way, isn't it? It's like basically don't have a child until you have, you've graduated, you graduate, you get your career, you get a lot of money in the bank, only then you get married, right? By that time, you're well into your 30s or whatever. And, and then you want to enjoy your married life before the child ruins that. And, and so, I noticed that being here in Penang, you just think, oh, actually, many parents actually have their children very late, in their mid to late 30s is often when they'll have their first child. But of course, that then leads to other issues as well, because if the later that you start having children, the harder it is to have children, and that's why you end up with all the other issues with IVF and all the other things as well, right? So in general, I think if we have a Christian worldview, we will tend to we won't feel that we need to have lots of money in the bank or whatever, and before we are able to get married, and we'll generally feel like we can have more children rather than less. But that's not saying you have to have unlimited children, and therefore that contraception is wrong. Do you want to ask any questions about that?
So basically for Christians, if in terms on the topic of IVF, is there a right or wrong, like a very clear-cut answers for us?
What I would say is, I don't think IVF is inherently wrong, as I said. I think, but I wouldn't think it's the first option. It's it's probably it's quite down the list as in terms of the options that Christians can have. So I think, of course, when you're trying to conceive a child, and if you're having trouble to conceive a child, then first step is you go and see your physician and get your body checked out, see if there's any particular reason why you can't do that. And then there's various things that they can do, right? They can help you to monitor the timing so that when the egg is coming out, so that you can try and do it at exactly the right time. They can do artificial insemination. There's various steps that they can take before you need to move to IVF, right? So I think sometimes people just jump there too quickly. And I think if you are going to do IVF, then what I would say is don't just jump in without talking to someone about it. Ideally, you talk to your pastor about it, and you know something about what are the ethical issues involved, right? So that you can engage. If you are going to engage in it, you engage in it in an ethical way that is pleasing to God. You know what the issues are, and therefore you make decisions that are going to be Christian. So, the number of eggs that you're going to have, the number of cycles you're going to try, what's your budget in terms of how much money, or whether you're going to consider adoption instead of doing that, or there's various questions, right? And I think what I often see happening is that people will struggle by themselves to have a child, and they can't do it, and then they're basically just recommended to go to IVF, and they just go straight to IVF, and they don't necessarily get any advice from their pastor or other Christians around them. And I think that's not very helpful. Yeah. So it's one of those things that, you know, it would be helpful if more of us read up on it, that we talked about it more, and then we'll be able to counsel people through those things.
I also, I mean, in the note, there's the topic of screening for disabilities. So does it mean like we screen the mother and also the baby when they are still in the wombs? That means the parents can decide whether to give birth the baby or not, is it?
Yeah, so prenatal screening, basically, they screen for various, they can screen for various potential defects or, you know, dangers or illnesses with the child. So, yeah. So again, it's very common for these prenatal screenings to be done. But Christians need to think carefully about it, right? So, you know, when our own children were going through pregnancy and so on, the doctors would offer, you know, various tests. You know, do you want to screen the child for Down syndrome or whatever, right? Because you can, you know, screen for that with a, you know, give you a particular percentage, you know, how at risk the child is and so on. So for us, we said, no, we don't want to do the test. Yeah. Because anyway, it make no difference to us, right? Whether the child got Down syndrome or not, we're going to be, whatever, you know, whatever defect or illness the child has, we are still going to bring the child into the world. So for what reason I need to inflict the test on the child, because it's not a painless test. The prenatal screenings is not painless tests for the children. They have, you know, they're invasive. They're often invasive tests. So why? So for us, we wouldn't even do the test, just because it doesn't make a difference to us. Now that's not to say that you can never do any prenatal screening. So for example, I know one family where basically one of their children was born with a hole in the heart, a heart defect, right? And the child needed to, you know, the child was born safely, but needed to go through several operations and so on after being born, and now the child is fine. Yeah. So when those same parents is having their next child, right? Of course, they do a careful examination of the heart, right? But the motivation for that is not that, okay, if there is some heart defect, then I'm going to abort the child. That's not what they are thinking. They're Christian parents, right? But so that if there is some defect, that they can give it the treatment, you know, give the baby the best possible treatment to survive, you know, that they can, right? And so what that's telling you is that the prenatal screenings, they can be used for good, or they can be used for evil. If the prenatal screening is just a thing, and saying unless this is a perfect, you know, a perfect fetus, then we're going to abort it. If that's the reason for the screening, then that's not helpful at all, is it? But if my motivation for the screening is thinking about how I can help this child to live, right, then that's very different, right? So your motivation and your purpose is often one of the key factors of what makes an action right or wrong, not just the thing itself, if that makes sense. Okay, and then just very briefly, there's the genetic, you know, stem cell research and things like that. Basically, as the notes say, the issue with the embryonic stem cell research, even though the stem cells have so much potential for, you know, for good in terms of medicine and so on, basically, in order to get the embryonic stem cells, you have to kill the fetus. So in that sense, there's no way a Christian can support that, because any kind of medical treatment that kills a fetus is not something a Christian can support. it's not, you can't say, look, the ends justifies the means, this is going to lead to medical breakthroughs that is going to, save people's lives. Well, does the fact that this treatment is going to save many people's lives mean that I can sacrifice this child's life? A Christian cannot think in this kind of consequentialist way, because God cares about the means as well as the consequences, right? And so there's a lot of this kind of embryonic stem cell research can be very problematic for Christians.